This is GovExec Daily, where we bring you the federal stories that really matter. It's March 8th, 2022. I'm Ross John Fortuna. The coronavirus crisis has forced people to think differently about the ways they work and how they manage. The move to remote work has upended regular office operations for many public servants, and managers have to adjust their way of leading their teams. Anthropologists can help government leaders in this new environment. By listening from afar, interacting with technology, and understanding office culture, managers can adjust to the new normal of the pandemic era and beyond by using the same techniques that the field of anthropology does. Stephen L. Katz held legal and management positions in the senior executive service during the Clinton administration and is the author of the book Lion Taming, Working Successfully with Leaders, Bosses, and Other Tough Customers. He's also the author of a post on our site headlined, Managing Effectively From Afar, Lessons from Anthropologists During the Pandemic. After a short break, he'll join me to discuss how agency leaders can learn from the field of anthropology about managing during the COVID crisis.
This content is brought to you by Oracle Cloud. From securing combat communications to creating actionable intelligence, U.S. warfighters count on Oracle Cloud for mission success. Find out more at oracle.com/DoD.
The COVID-19 crisis has presented a series of challenges for public servants and for managers. Despite President Joe Biden's endorsement of in-office work for feds recently, telework and hybrid work are here to stay. Managers are going to have to find ways to continue to lead their teams and find new ways to collaborate, communicate, and learn in this new environment. In a post on our site headlined, Managing Effectively From Afar, Lessons from Anthropologists During the Pandemic, our guest today writes that leaders can learn from the field of anthropology during this period. Stephen L. Katz held management and legal positions in the senior executive service during the Clinton administration. He served in the Clinton White House and has consulted across many other agencies. He's also the author of the book Lion Taming, Working Successfully with Leaders, Bosses, and Other Tough Customers. He's led training for leadership and management development across government and has degrees in anthropology, history, and law. He joins our show now to discuss what agency leaders can learn from anthropologists. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Russ.
So let's start with a broad question. How are the primary benefits of thinking like an anthropologist visible in government today?
That's a great question. Anthropologists share a lot of characteristics with people who become managers and executives, and specifically political appointees. And that's because they are outsiders to the cultures that they study. And they overcome this by utilizing participant observation methodology, in which they immerse themselves in the culture by living and participating in the everyday life. As a second parallel, they too, due to the pandemic, have had to leave the countries that they're in, and they've lost more than just sacrificing a beltway commute every day. The anthropologists I know and interviewed for this article left everywhere from Chiapas in Mexico to Chad and Cameroon in Africa, people in Serbia. Indonesia has been shut down for a full 2 years. And so anthropologists found themselves returning back to their countries. Well, quite interestingly, the biggest parallel that developed in the advantage of thinking like an anthropologist came about because there's a subfield of digital anthropology. They study the use of technology in our cultures around the world. And so instead of planting themselves inside villages in the Philippines, for example, they are studying not only the use of technology, but they're using it themselves to conduct interviews remotely. And that's what really got me interested in coming up with a contrasting angle or metaphor so that we could see how can we do a better job of making sure as managers that we listen to employees and understand what's going on in our agencies from a remote distance, working from home during the pandemic.
Well, you mentioned listening in understanding employees. Let's talk about how to do that better. What do public servants say about their communication with their colleagues during the pandemic? What do managers say? How does that interaction evolved?
Let's start with executives and managers because that's a principal audience for GovExec. The managers that I interviewed, and I actually did so at over a dozen agencies in all different places, from the military to civilian, so on and so forth, because of my past work in the SES and as the author of Lion Taming, I've done a lot of training and I continue to do consulting. And people coming up the food chain, so to speak, are the principal audience that I help the most, because if you think about it, we hire people for their specialty or their interest in a subject. We promote them for the last thing they did super well. We don't necessarily know whether they can manage because they didn't have any management responsibilities, not the big sense, people, operations, finance, evaluation, project management, even congressional relations, and so forth. So you really have to be open-minded, even a good listener, when you're the person selecting and promoting someone. Now, I say that because I've had to do it in my 8 years in the SES. There were many positions that the agency head and I had to promote people into. And they weren't just for usual career path, Ross. They were often because the agency had a hiring freeze on and the positions had to be filled. Someone retired unexpectedly, or in one agency, we reshuffled the deck precisely because the experts who were the SES, some cases, they were great as an economist or a scientist. They weren't so good at managing people. So we went to OPM and we converted the position to senior level, the SL designation, removed them from the management role. And guess what? That meant other people had to come up, even though we kept them as the highly compensated expert that we wanted them to be. Now, the managers I interviewed who were GS 14s, 15s, and SES all pretty much said the same thing, that they were spending much more time during the pandemic arranging their schedule. In other words, working more hours, but trying to be more efficient to find out what was going on in their organization. Craig Barton, who's interviewed at the end of the article and works in one of the military service agencies, really was very crisp. You know, he said, I've had to be much more intentional about my management and leadership. Ross, I've had no less than 3 emails just on that comment. Okay. You know, they usually start by saying, Steve, thanks for the great article. That guy was right. You know, they don't know him, but they know that what he's saying is very true. And then they explain what's going on for them. So I would say the first issue during the pandemic is how people grew into the telework process as a full-time way of working. By the way, I had not met anyone who didn't like it. I'm not saying they would prefer it full-time, but I think quite a few of them found that they were actually learning a lot more because it really increased the number of direct channels. Daniel Miller, the anthropologist I quoted from the University of London, who's the digital anthropologist, his great comment was, now he had done traditional anthropology for a very long time, but he had a community in Italy he was interviewing for purposes related to technology. And he is absolutely convinced that the reason those webcam interviews were so productive is because the idea of, confessional in the churches in Italy really was the frame of reference for people who really had not engaged in Zoom. Really very interesting. In our country, it's a little different. The challenge in government is that we hire people for subject matter interest and growth potential. We do not hire them for their people skills. I once wrote an article for Fed Times called Hire Leaders, Not Loners. And the reason was that when I went through the Myers-Briggs process, I actually did it at GAO, where I was senior advisor to David Walker, the former comptroller general. And GAO is an audit agency, so it's Myers-Briggs scale is going to be very homogeneous. And that was one of the cultural aspects that I recognized when I got there. How are we going to actually develop rapport and trust with this agency? And Dave and I started essentially the same month. If they're not inclined to be so sociable, they're definitely not extroverted. And by the way, that's a quality of auditors globally. I'm talking about the GAO culture. Guess what? For a good part of the last 8 years, I was hired by USAID in their Democracy, Rights, and Governance program, principally with former state IG and GAO or Jackie Williams-Bridgers. And Jackie really led the work. I would go in and do like multi-month assessments and consulting with agency heads ranging from civil service to anti-corruption to audit, but Indonesia, the Philippines, Serbia, Armenia, and auditors are auditors. And so there ends up being a cultural definition to the agency based on that profession. Just like at NASA, in my consulting to them, I always built in these several days of discussion interviews with employees before we did anything. And guess what? At NASA, they have an engineering mentality and a science mentality, but it's very, very much determined by the history of that agency. Be very careful. This is a dangerous business. We may be creating conditions, FBI and CIA, high-level distrust of outsiders, FBI more so than the agency, but I've done a lot of work. I worked with ODNI as well. Guess what? The agency is a secrecy agency. It's not terribly surprising that 9/11 had a lot of problems of sharing information, right? But it turns out in the normal decision-making process, they're not always so good at it either. So they have to overcome that cultural tendency. I'll give you just one quick example. At GAO, Comptroller General Walker and I were involved in really in-depth assessments, top to bottom. The technique that I described with Katie Nelson, going to the chief of the tribe to get people to talk to you. Of course, in their case, they could add spears thrown at them, but it feels the same way when you're a Fed or an appointee. And Dave and I were very coordinated and logical and making sure everybody knew that, it was important to the Comptroller General, that others in the department were signing on, that they could make time on their calendar. These subjects, were open for discussion, even though we had to build into it. We did it not by starting one-on-one. We did it actually starting with groups, with managers involved. And that way, people saw their bosses participating. So that in many ways was a technique from anthropology. We really we knew there were a lot of problems. First of all, the agency had a budget and hiring freeze for 5 to 8 years. I mean, boy, if you have all those positions vacant, you've got to fill them and people not going through management training. It's tough, but the issue at GAO, based on their culture, is you promote an auditor to a management position, they're going to treat every decision based on the same requirements of an audit. And guess what? You're never going to be able to make a decision if you're applying audit standards to what they call footing the decision. You'll never get the hire done. You'll never get the document cleared. So part of our discussion was understanding that and then going forward. And the same thing at CIA, OD&I, how much can you share? And what do we have to do? And who has to give the okay? So there's a lot of cultural angles that anthropologists can be helpful with.
So sort of to that end, you're sort of talking about it now, but do you have any other sort of examples of cultures within government, within agencies that are sort of distinct and observable, a la an anthropologist, that are important to be aware of? And then how does that sort of port over to this remote hybrid telework environment?
Okay. Well, I think from my experience, the reason why anthropology is useful and provides contrasts is because it forces you to step back. You're an outsider because you are an outsider, but during the pandemic, you're an outsider because physically you've been displaced. And because, as I talked about Katie Nelson's observation that Zoom, like we can't interrupt each other on Zoom very easily. We can see each other wanting to talk, but we can't actually override each other as well. And the comments I've had during the pandemic is people feel that they've been able to say more. What they feel they're missing is the glue that is possibly making everybody feel part of the same mission. And I actually talked about this with somebody working at a big consulting firm the other day, but whose clients are all governmental. She's never met any of them. She's a recent graduate from Georgetown. When they first started, all she saw were their faces. She has no idea where their offices are. She doesn't know who they get information from. Think of the things that are so important in your work. Like if you had to get something from Amelia, who is my editor, or Courtney Bublé, who's a reporter who's doing a terrific job for GovExec, you would know where to find her. If you guys were in the office, well, how do you do it now? And how do you read between the lines? And what happens if you don't hear anything? Does that mean you can go ahead with what you were planning to say? I can tell you the answer is no. So there's a lot of what we call meta or other kinds of information. So the advantage of taking an anthropological view is they think big picture, they think holistic, then they fill in the details, and then they try to identify patterns. So for me, when I interview people by Zoom, which I've done a lot of, just as, by the way, before I worked for USAID, I was doing consulting with the World Bank, and I was in charge of a huge study related to human capital, actually, and talent in African countries. And once or twice a week, this giant conference room screen would light up, and we would basically pipe in the HR heads of the World Bank offices from Ghana to Pretoria to Nairobi to Abuja. Really not a whole lot different. And so we had to do a lot of preparation. And the one thing that I think the pandemic has created in this way, Ross, is on the one hand, it seems like it's created more independence from the office. I find if you're engaged closely with your colleagues and your boss, there's a lot of interdependence. And there's a lot of information that people are finding out. Do you need this? I was talking to someone recently who's a scientist in one of the federal agencies. They had confirmed that, in fact, what their co-managers felt was missing was the informal hallway discussions. Just to get a feel for, we can't get a feel as easily during the pandemic. I was talking to a career official at USAID the other day, and he was telling me in reaction to the article that he really glommed on to that opening paragraph because at his agency, some of the career people have set up what are called virtual office hours, intending to pick up that hallway information. So the truth is, even though we may be missing some of that, what I'm really interested in, I've recommended to the administration that they should immediately start engaging in a study of telework during the pandemic as a success story. Now, this has been going on for 2 full years. We're going to find out that some agencies like GAO, they had a robust telework program in existence already. So it was smoother, but guess what? Their workforce is more homogeneous, Ross. So it's a little, I think, easier in some ways to do it. It's more acceptable to management. By the way, one of the emails I got congratulating me and thanking me for the article was from Comptroller General Gene Dodaro. It's not just that GovExec is read by people at the top of the food chain. We're touching on issues that they're working away at. Nobody has really commented from another perspective so that they can get a sense of how they're doing. And I recommended to the Comptroller General, I don't know whether this is necessarily in GAO's wheelhouse, but we need to come up with the best practices of what worked better, what's going to help people when they go back to the office. And so I think the anthropological view is useful because of the emphasis on listening and the cross-cultural use of technology.
Yeah, I think that's GAO sort of is an interesting comparison because, anyone in DC probably knows somebody at GAO, and certainly I've heard a lot about their telework policy, and you mentioned the homogeneity of it, and that's interesting in comparing it to some other agencies, particularly those who have more frontline people versus headquarters, those kinds of things, TSA stuff. So it's certainly interesting to look at the way that those agencies have dealt with the pandemic and the hybrid work situation. And I count me among the your admirers for this piece, and I will thank you for being on the show with us.
Russ, thank you very much. And any questions people have, my email is on at the bottom of the article. And GovExec continues to lead the way in excellent journalism related to government.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Thanks for listening to GovExec Daily. Our show was produced by Adam Butler and hosted by me, Ross John Fortuna. We want to thank Stephen L. Katz for joining the program. Our music is the song Signals by Catfish Dancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can email us any feedback at podcast@govexec.com or hit us up on Twitter @govexec. We'd love to hear from you. We'll talk to you later.